Anyway, Chuck, thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Carlo.
I have the nice distinction of having written you back in the 20th century, and now into this terrible new age of anxiety we all live in.
Indeed.
So I thought, because it's nice to geek out a little bit, I thought it'd be fun to just kind of really start talking a bit about posters as a medium, because it's a really specific one. And we could talk a little bit about your techniques, your skills that way, because there's that great video that they put in the gallery where people actually get to see what you do, and it's not working at a computer screen.
Yeah.
And but then also talk about the history of posters that inspired you and how it becomes an art form. So which one do you want to do first? Let's do the art, the kind of thinking about what got you into posters. Who were the poster artists you love? What were the things about the medium that drew you to it?
Yeah. Well, the poster artists that I loved, off the bat, I probably encountered in my brother's room, Jody. He had Jefferson Airplane posters. He had
Fillmore era stuff?
Fillmore era stuff. And my brother Rob had, a map of Vietnam, but also some Wes Wilson and Victor Moscoso and stuff like that. But we were getting those from head shops,
That was the whole kind of in underground comics. A lot of things kind of came up through that.
Totally. Basically, it was all that Bill Graham psychedelic 60s stuff that San Francisco was pumping out. Yeah. And that's what got me into it. I think there was a little bit of an accent from Detroit, the Detroit scene.
Well, Stanley Mouse, kind of went down there. He was originally a car customizer.
He was a car customizer.
And Gary Grimshaw was great.
Gary Grimshaw. He was doing all the Russ Ham posters, the Grandy Ballroom. Yep. Iggy Pop, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And
did that resonate with you, being from the Midwest?
Yeah. I read Robert Crumb comics and Robert Williams comics and S. Clay Wilson, and I didn't even understand that stuff. It was so over the top.
Well, I think when we think about those Warner Brothers cartoons we grew up on, there was a lot of stuff probably going over our head then as well.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, in fact, that stuff's considered too violent to even expose people to now.
Yeah, I think Three Stooges is a trigger and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting overlap in that kind of Bay Area youthquake of the 60s scene, because you did have this pantheon of the Zap comic artists that you talked about.
The Zap comic artists.
And then, Moscoso, Wilson.
The Big Five.
Both of them were basically Big Fives. And then you had these people like Rick Griffin, who kind of belonged to both. And
Right. And in Rick's work, there's just sort of this mysticism that you find yourself staring at a poster longer than you stare at posters normally.
Yeah. And
because you just have to figure that out. It's almost like a hieroglyphic, And so that kind of thing, that comes out later in my work, that I want to produce stuff that attracts you to further investigate the graphic and spend some more time with it. At first, I'm just trying to get the idea out there, communicate. So, my generation is coming on the scene, and we're doing Xerox punk rock flyers. So you just want to shock someone in black and white. So a lot of times you're just grabbing a photograph, and then you're scrolling on it, and then reproducing everything by Xerox. So it's the simplest, most direct kind of form of poster art. So that's kind of where I got started. Lower East Side. Yeah. Was working on an underground comic called World War III.
Well, I was going to say it was the World War III guys, but this was also a very political-based kind of art agitprop kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think the underground scene had kind of become canon and a bit accepted. I mean, there was a Zap show at Psychedelic Solution, and the underground comic artists that were kind of firing people up were like Gary Tanner, Charles Burns, and they were working for Raw magazine.
Art
and Raw,
Spiegelman, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of arty.
Oh, totally
And-
arty.
yeah, but punk, challenging. And World War III was working the territory of like political satire and agitprop, and so we
And tied in with the squatters movement, because we're going through a period of gentrification. Then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, after the abandonment of the cities, now it's like developers are coming in instead of homesteaders, and it became very fraught.
Yeah, it actually created a nice safety zone though for art to happen.
Yeah.
So there was like a whole group of squatters that were taking over buildings and making it hard for developers to get in there and turn them into luxury condominiums. And in between are these galleries that are opening with these like cheap spaces that are kind of converted garages and warehouses and stuff. And it was a really vital scene. So there was an interplay between the fine art that was being produced in the neighborhood and the political art that was being produced in the neighborhood. It was kind of a conversation.
Yeah, and that was another
And,
thing that was going on. I mean, these conversations were all happening in DIYs, but over all sorts of different kind of mediums and spaces, and
Yeah.
and posters kind of go into that. That
Oh,
whole thing.
absolutely.
That's what posters were.
Yeah. So, Seth Tabachman always said that I was kind of a political artist, but like it really looks like San Francisco's psychedelic stuff.
Yeah.
I always had that sort of psychedelic angle on things. He's like, you might think about posters,
Really?
Yeah, he said that. It was just really
so
rando
we can
when he
blame
said
him.
it. Well, he would say rando, kind of really insightful things.
Yeah.
But, after about 4 or 5 years, I bailed from New York. It was right after
we
the...
run through the best of them. They all leave New York wounded and like needing a little bit of California to get their feet back under them.
There was like some heavy scene going on, and I was like, is this what it's going to be like for the next decade?
Yeah,
I'm not
it's
sure.
Probably worse. You got out to dodge just in time.
Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to, because thinking about the 60s psychedelic tradition that came out of the Bay Area. A lot of them, especially Wes Wilson, but a lot of them were also looking at these older posters like Musha and people like that,
Yeah.
which was like this Art Nouveau kind of material, which inspired them, and so because that
it's
worked in well with psychedelia, because all curvy kind of stuff.
What's really interesting? Wes Wilson had a show on Telegraph in 1965, and 2 months before, Alfred Roller had a show, and Roller was a Viennese artist,
Yeah.
and he worked with this sort of socially conscious collective called the Werkstatt.
In the teens and 20s, basically.
Teens
right?
and 20s.
Yeah.
And this is like 1920, and he's doing this psychedelic lettering style. And if you look at Victor Moscoso or Wes Wilson, but Wes Wilson is
The most.
often credited with like kind of developing the curvilinear type
But he
forms.
got it directly from an earlier form of
He
poster art.
completely got it from a directly,
And
yeah.
when I look at like some of your your best work in this show, and there's a lot of it, and a lot of it like seems to go actually back to
Yes.
back to that kind of Viennese.
I'm
like,
going
whatever.
back to that watering hole.
Yeah.
I just, I'm really influenced by Klimt and the Werkstatt and Vienna's Succession and also Art Nouveau.
Yeah.
I
But
read
that's the
about...
look very much of the widespread Panic posters, and also
Yeah.
the wonderful the Edwardian Ball material.
Yeah,
you've
it's
been
from
doing.
that era.
Yeah, so it's really kind of great.
Yeah, well, I'm also like using some of the formats that they were using, like the 2-sheet, like those double diptychs, they're like top and bottom for like the Margot Tenenbaum poster. Yeah, that one. And that's a direct reference to Alphonse Mucha poster, Medea. And it's a little complicated, but it makes sense in regard to Wes Anderson. and
Which
that
was
movie.
actually the biggest selling image of its day. It was sort of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I don't know what like a Basquiat image now or something. It was like so overpopulated, saturated, defined the era.
Sarah Bernhardt was like this entertainment force. She was like a sex symbol, and she took control of like the production. She got people to write her plays. You know, they were musical plays and stuff. And this is like 1895 through 1910 or 15 or something like that. And she even hired her own theater. So she was like completely DIY, and she was going to not fall into having a producer make all the money and her just be sort of over here. So she did all that stuff, but she hired like Alphonse Mucha to do one of her first musical theatrical plays in 1895 or something like that. And it was Gismonda, and it just made his career. It was this beautiful two-sheet, just like that Margot poster, and all over Paris, and made Mucha like a sensation overnight. Then he did the same thing. He kind of took a page out of her book and did DIY, hired his own printers, and started producing like mass posters. And I think his first series of self-produced posters through his own printing was The Seasons. And I only became aware of that after I did the Seasons series for Widespread Panic. I didn't know the significance of when that fell into his career, but I knew about the pieces. And so I was kind of referencing that. But I have the same attitude. I'm like in charge of my own production. It's my press. I do the printing. You know, for a long time, I was just selling directly through my own medium, but it was kind of influenced by my knowledge of like how the independent artists of that era had like gotten their names out there. Like if Sarah Bernhardt had not promoted herself, no one would know who she was.
Right. She wouldn't have had the length of her career because people get tossed to the wayside when
they, and so we had this like really kind of colorful scene going on in San Francisco that I was documenting. It was like, there I am. I moved from New York, started working in San Francisco in like 89. And we had like the same kind of scene. There was like cabaret with like comical theater and like punk rock bands, and there were burlesque dancers, and you know.
Well, San Francisco had long histories of all those things, you know.
Totally.
The North Beach strip clubs, which was the beginning of like that whole thing in America, to SF Mime Troupe, which also has a great history of posters.
A little bit more multi-dimensional than just going to a show and, you know, getting a drink ticket and going.
Engaging communities.
Yeah. And there was a lot of satire, you know, in some of the, like even the burlesque dancing was like kind of politically charged. It was kind of funny. Yeah, you know, the thing is, you know, I coming to San Francisco, I also realized that the silkscreen medium was like really coming out of the Chicano movement of the 1970s. It's like, you know, Chagoya and Montoya, and basically they brought silkscreen to California. So when I did the ISW, you know, Incredibly Strange Wrestling posters, I was like kind of referencing some of that stuff. So there's like the United
the
Fruit.
Lucha Libre Mexican wrestling.
Totally.
Good.
So that whole thing was like usually emceed by like Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys. You would have like a wrestler called El Homo Loco versus El Borracho Gigante, and they would have sort of like a satire, political theater, fake. I mean, it was like super fake wrestling, but like all for effect, you know? And it was really fun. It was a blast. And so I got to do those, and it was kind of my first popular series of posters, you know? People would like come to the shows just to get the goods, you know?
Yeah, there was a lot of hybridity then. I think of like that guy in L.A., Elvez, who like
Yeah.
was like a Mexican Chicano, but like acted as like a Mexican Elvis impersonator, but it was kind of totally punk as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there was a lot of, I mean, basically.
That was kind of a movement in the Chicano movement
Yeah.
of the 80s, 90s,
Yeah.
where like the first show that Ron and I did was at Palazzo Gallery, and it was 3 artists. It's Michael Roman from the Lower East Side.
Bless his soul.
Yeah, Chucho
Rest in
Perez,
peace.
Lawrence Colacion. But they identified first as punks.
Yeah.
They're like, we don't want to work at the Mission Cultural Center because, we're being finessed into this community.
It was ghettoized. It was sort of like if you weren't making shrines with flowers and loaves of bread.
And free
you
to
were like-
art.
Yeah, exactly. Free to art.
And so, like Chucho had been like punk number 1 of the Mexico City scene. And so when he moved to San Francisco, he had this whole legend and reputation. And he was actually a conduit which punk music was coming from Mexico. And so some of those bands were getting included into the ISW shows, and it was just a blast. It was really cool. It was like a nice kind of multicultural event in San Francisco where the two cultures were actually like stepping on each other's shoes. I had a brush with Shigoya that was hilarious.
Yeah.
I was at the Aschenbach having a meeting with the archivist lady, and I was bringing them like the first posters that ever got into a museum setting, and I'm sitting at a table, and she did the thing where she goes, "Okay, tell me about yourself and your art." And it's just like, oh God.
Oh, I should have started
this
with
mic
that.
on?
I should have started with that. That would have been such a good lead question.
So I'm sitting with my back to all the drawers of art and stuff like that, and I guess the thing about this archive is that artists who are in the archive can bring people to like look at their stuff or look at other people's stuff. And while I'm talking, Shigoya had come in with a class and was standing behind me, and I'm like, well, the thing about San Francisco is that it's this cross-pollination between Mexican culture and Anglo culture, and that the silkscreen movement really, truly came from like the Chicano art scene of the 1970s, and all of a sudden he like grabs my shoulders and goes, "Well done, son."
Nice. Yeah, good. You got it right. A lot of people don't acknowledge that stuff. Yeah, that's beautiful. But well, why don't I don't really even have the equipment to actually ask you the smart questions of this, but get a little bit into the process and what you're doing and how it distinguishes itself from people working on a computer and doing glisses that we were talking about earlier, or like all these other modes of cultural production associated with works on paper.
Right.
Like you're not doing lithographs either. So
Right.
Silkscreen's kind of an industrial route, and
Totally.
tell us about it.
Well, it kind of falls into a broad category of process art. So like, if say you're painting, there is a process involved, but it's really direct brush to paint onto the canvas. It's like a real conversation right there. Process art takes steps and stages, So screen printing, in order for you to get a multicolored print with everything in line, it's like I have to separate all the colors out, A lot of times I'll just start from the black. So I will get the job, and I'll start sketching stuff for the client to look at. And once I get kind of a rough draft going, I show that to them. It's a pencil. And I'm usually drawing on like printer paper, Then I'll scan that into the computer so that I can make a darkened version of that, and I'll tape it to the back of a drawing paper, light table it, and draw from my pencil. And I'm using brush and ink on paper, the old-fashioned way. I'm not using the tablet where I'm drawing here and looking there, or now it's like you can actually draw on a video screen, pick your brush. Nah. I use a real brush, real ink, because I kind of want the materials to communicate with me. I want to play with that. And
in almost an alchemical way, right?
Yeah, it is kind of alchemical.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
It's the way some of those things interface, those screens. It's sort of like, there's
there's
it's
also
more than
this
the sum of its parts somehow.
Well, there's kind of an ethos about guys that draw with brush and ink, and it kind of comes from the comic thing, I think. But it's like there's a samurai attitude about it, like, keeping your, being zen about like not making mistakes and thicks and thins and having a nice line and keeping it smooth and. Almost all the brush and ink guys I know use Winsor Newton, fine sable brushes, and that's a whole story. Because there was an embargo, and they're made out of foxtail, and it comes from Russia, and so those things are being black marketed at this time. But it's like,
wow.
Yeah,
it's all supply chain issues.
It's supply chain issues. I think Jack White has.
He's got a tour called Supply Chain Issues
Yeah,
Tour.
Supply Chain Issues.
I love that. I was going like, I don't
like,
really want to go
we
see.
need another 1,000 shirts. Well, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to wait.
I try to do that with my writing now. When I'm late, I'm just like, I'm sorry, the truck of ideas is being held at the border.
So I'll get the black line, and one of the things about like doing the drawing is I really like to keep a clean original, So typically, out of hundreds and hundreds that I have now, that there's no whiteout. If I make a mistake, I work it in. If it's a horrible mistake, I start over, And so it's sort of like, this whole conversation with the paper. And then that analog touchy-feely part is kind of over at that point because you have to get the color translated into a printable form. So I scan that into the computer, pretty high resolution, and then start to build paths in Photoshop. And I'll do the outline, and then I start cutting all the parts apart. And I think the interesting takeaway on this for everyone here is that I work in black and white through that whole process. It may be 2 days or 3 days of like picking the colors, but I'm doing it by percentage. So it's 55% magenta, 10% blue, and I do that all in black and white. And it's only when I start to crunch the layers and put them in mezzotint or halftone until it's like 100 layers crushed down to blue, red, yellow, silver, gold, black, white, translucent layer for like patterns on the skin. Once it's crunched down, then I do a color and I see how I did. And about 80% of the time, I've envisioned it by like mathematical percentages. So that's how much of a printer I've become over the years, Sometimes I'll do a test or like I go, both of those flowers say are like purple and they need to be distinguished from each other. And I go back to the layer and I redo it and I'll change it around.
Yeah, it's funny to hear you talk because I'm working on something with Shepard Fairey, who's another guy who did a lot of posters.
Yeah.
And silk screening guy.
Who's that?
Yeah, exactly. But and I'm going, another guy I probably hadn't written about in 20 years or something like that. I go, yeah, so Shep, like, what are some of the things we should talk about for like the more recent work? And he goes, because he's always used those kind of really hardcore black, red,
Right.
kind
He's
of like
got a palette.
fascist kind of palette of propaganda. And he goes,
it's like from the communist,
exactly.
constructivist posters.
Exactly. And,
red, yellow, red, yellow, black. How
yeah.
can you go wrong?
Yeah. And he goes, well, now I'm using like lots of blue and stuff like that because I realized that other was just too aggressive for people, and now I want to be a little more welcoming and earthy and stuff like that. But
that's cool. I've never been afraid of color. I think you guys might have noticed that.
Yeah.
One of the things that distinguishes, like, a lot of artists are told, find a palette. And one of the things that distinguishes my palette is that it's pretty wide, But it does fall into a tonal range. It's just because I like to play with color. Color is very inspiring for me.
I
So
think it makes your work more sensuous than we normally associate with like graphic work.
right. There's kind of a painterly aspect. I'm bringing in kind of splatter textures and all that kind of thing. I mean, this would be an insane conversation for me to be having in 1995, because basically I wanted to use fluorescent color, draw something shocking, and get your attention from like 100 feet away.
Yeah.
Like you're walking down the street in the record store, there's this fluorescent thing that just grabbed your eye, and you walked across the street to see, what the fuck is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and so we kind of, could tie you in easily into like certain 60s psychedelic traditions, but you did have punk in the middle there. And
Yeah,
you did have this
yeah.
kind of other mode of much more aggressive, much more like, I can't either tackled you and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
also learned really direct modes of address,
No doubt. I would have had a more like situationism. There's this. It's a political theory, but it's also an art theory, and it's
Guy
about
Debord.
Guy
It's a sign
Debord.
of
It's
spectacle.
about like turning situations on their head, taking writing, collaging it so that it says something that the original piece didn't intend, that you start to express yourself through found objects. Comics are like, they take out all the word balloons and they put new words in there, and sometimes it's a political purpose.
Yeah, so it was a whole strategy called détournement. is actually what
Détournement, yeah.
Which was like that every, sign actually has another meaning, and it's your job to bring it out, like the fascist
Yeah.
undertones or whatever like
Well,
that, or the latent sexuality.
Because they felt that like the whole media environment that we live in, the billboards we see, the stuff we see on our phones, I mean, they would say that now, the social media, the television, the radio, it surrounds us, and it kind of informs like how we feel about things. And it's called the spectacle. That
Society of
whole
the spectacle, yeah.
yeah, that
Very
whole
coercive.
yeah. And so it's somehow we're kind of floating in this propaganda medium, And so it's time to take their signifiers and reassign them so that it says stuff that the people feel, not what someone wants you to feel.
And
So-
I never, all the years, I never knew you were into the Situationist International.
Dude,
because-
I got to print on Guy Debord's press.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice, my God.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
okay, so I did a show in Paris, and there was this graffiti artist named SNCF, which is the French Rail.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
that, the name sort of implies that he's like spray painting on
A
train
vandal.
cars. He's a vandal. So SNCF is like sitting there going, dude, these posters, they're so amazing. I have friends, they must see. And so I'm like getting a cigarette outside, and I hear him on the phone going, get down here, the blah, 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 in French. And about 15 minutes or half an hour later, here come like two young guys his age, and they're like, whoa. And the guy starts asking me, like, how do you do this? Like, how do you do all these layers and da-da-da-da-da? Well, he was a student at the Beaux-Arts, and I was supposed to print a poster for a punk band, but I had to do the show, and I just grabbed the films. I was like, maybe I'll meet someone, and I did. There they were.
Amazing.
So he invited me into the Paris Beaux-Arts
Yeah.
NSPA to print this punk rock poster, and like his angle is that he wanted to be my intern.
Sorry. I'm one of those divas. I need these things. Go ahead.
Go with it, Carlo. So he like burned and prepared my screens. He pinholed everything. He had the paper waiting for me. We had the first screen blocked up the next day after I dropped off the films with him and had the initial kind of beer session with him. And we printed this punk rock poster, and I'm like just about done, and he goes, so this is the Atelier Populaire where they made all the posters
This is
during
so
May
important.
1968 in Paris.
The student revolts, and this was a Situationist International. So it was, the great, it shut, of course, Paris loves to shut down for a protest, but this shut down.
Yeah, it's kind of regular
country.
now. But,
yeah, and it was such radical material. Untitled Chapter, and by the way, they would hate us right now, because they are like, the posters can never be bought or sold. They can never be hung in a museum. Any way you make them culture takes away their radical potential. They would hate us.
Yeah,
Like really,
yeah.
like, we're the ones who've turned it now into a capitalist commodity.
But French people aren't critical.
Ba-da-boom, right? It almost went over my head. But were you? So you're inspired by that.
And I'm like, are you kidding me? And he goes, no, this is like the press that Guy Debord made all the posters. And I'm like, I dropped on my knees. I did.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, dude, it's okay.
Well, of course, it was a student revolts, really. It was similar in America. It got echoed in like the Columbia student revolts, or later on in Kent State.
Kent State.
But the first site of it was the Musée des Beaux-Arts. It was it's always a student revolt, and it's usually the artists.
The difference with that student revolt is that they tried to tie it together with the worker unions, and so it was like that was the difference. And that's what made it really kind of astounding, actually.
And then the best graffiti during that time as well. They would have things like, which you could translate, like underneath the pavement, the beach. There's these kind of ways of magical thinking which disrupt the society, the spectacles. Like, just imagine that. Just imagine like somehow there's a beach here, and what is that kind of special space?
Sous la pierre, la plage.
Yeah.
Or TV, your God.
Yeah. Those were great. And also, so that's a 60s thing tied into what we were talking about earlier, but incredibly influential on punk. Malcolm McLaren and the Sex Pistols came directly, the artist for that. Jamie Reed, directly out of Situationist. And then people like Banksy, right?
I'm going to tie that in. I'm going to tie that in. Okay. So I did a Power to the Peaceful show, and I met Banksy's printers. And they were these guys in Birmingham, and they, of course, could not divulge who he is. But they were doing all of his posters. And they said, if you ever come to England, look us up. And so I had a show in Birmingham later, and I'm like, I'll look these guys up. And we had a funny session meeting these guys. And we had this long talk about, because they were doing reprints of all the Atelier Populaire stuff.
No kidding.
Yeah. And I said, did you get permission from the...
there is no copyright.
This is for Laser Rides, right? The big gallery that Banksy...
Paul Lazaridis, yeah.
Yeah,
Lazaridis, yeah.
Lazaridis. So,
but I should do it in the East End accent sounding like a thug, and that's really how you say his name. But go ahead.
Yeah, London stuff. So like, I said, that's kind of cool, but did you get permission? Are you working with, or like any of the Situationists in France know about this, or like is money going back? And I said, what would be really cool is if you really did like radical art and really got the permission of the guy, and we did an edition, and I'm pretty good friends with Emory Douglas.
He's great. This is the guy who did all the Black Panther Party imagery. He was a minister of propaganda for the BPP, based in Oakland.
Yeah, so we kind of did our thing, and we did a collaboration. It was an anti-war poster about the British and American collaboration in Iraq, and it was a pretty cool poster. It's in my book.
What page?
Yeah. I don't know, Carlo. It's a big book.
Yeah, I know.
But at the end of like working on these posters, one of the guys at the shop came up with an envelope, and he goes, "Here's your pay," and he goes, "But don't spend that." And I open it up, and it's one of those Banksy tenors.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
nice.
yeah.
That's very good.
And I said, "Can you tell me a little bit about this?" And he said, "Nope," because they were doing something really kind of subversive with that. But we did hook up Emory Douglas. I did a series of 4 prints. I had to take the scans that he did at 600 DPI of the Black Panther Party papers. He's got like everything scanned. He's protected by the Artist Rights Society. I had to write them and get permission.
Good.
But if you got the artist permission, you're going to be okay. And then I cleaned up these. I mean, these scans were so good that you had all the paper pulp and all the dust that was stuck under the zipatone halftones that he used. Like, there was this thing in the 70s where you take your line drawing, you get this
is the
plastic,
acetates, right?
The acetates. You get the plastic that had the dot pattern that you're going to print to get different colors, like, you know, and you stuck it to the thing. Well, there was always hair and dust and all this stuff underneath that, and these scans are so good that they you know, picked all that up. So I had to blow this stuff up so that the dots are like this on my computer screen.
Which,
and
by
just
the way, is
clean
the
it
look
up,
when you
so-
think of Roy Lichtenstein painting. That's what he's riffing on.
Totally. And so I'm over there, and a friend of mine who's like a, you know, Vietnam War vet and da-da-da-da-da came in. He's like, I used to grab that newspaper in Berkeley whenever they came out. Those are great. He's like, don't clean that up too much. It's going to lose some of the pizzazz, you know? And I'm like, yeah, I got
Surface noise is good. I mean, do you ever work? I mean, I
Yeah.
think like when we listen to an old vinyl record, we kind of like a little bit of that crackle, right? It's like
Yeah, that's why you
the
buy
patina
vinyl.
on an old painting or
Totally,
something.
totally.
So do you ever work with that kind of
Oh, yeah.
history of hauntology, what we might say?
Yeah, no, I'm down for that. I mean, a lot of those Devo posters kind of have that blocked up
They're all about de-evolution. Right?
de-evolution,
So that's perfect.
and yeah, so I kind of put that stuff into collage art that I do. There's like, you know, you'll see that I'm kind of finding my voice, like as you go through the rooms, you're seeing the muses kind of appear more and more, and that's kind of my vehicle of expression. But I've explored a lot of those sort of issues with graphics and collage and Xerox and kind of lo-fi, and I really like that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you are working in a kind of arcane medium, so
It
you
is.
might as well embrace
Dude, it's
that.
getting more arcane by the minute. I mean, the whole screen print thing is like going like completely digital. You know, it's almost like you could send a black and white image to a screen company. They will burn it laser right into the emulsion and wash it out right there. So
It's amazing. I've always loved stencils as another kind of like really weird, obsolete thing that keeps somehow reemerging, like the people who do stencils on the street. Well, now you can just burn the stencils right out of one digital file on you, and literally it's like you can have the 1,800 stencils you need to make this incredible thing. But it's like sort of like, wow, you're not hand cutting that. You actually like just did that. You know, I'm kind of like, isn't that cheating? It's like, no, the art's good. It's like, okay, I'll stop being such a Luddite.
yeah, I do like the analog medium part. I mean, I only got partway through the process, you know, when we were talking about printing. After I do all that stuff on the computer and it's crunched down to like 6 or 7 films, I send that to a film house. They're the guys that make film positives or film negatives for plate. So it's like for offset plate, you know, printing. And
But that never has as many layers, right? That's only like 2.
one color at a time.
Right.
And so they're going to punch out like 6 colors, 6 films for 6 colors. Then I get my screen. I coat it with photographic emulsion with a screen coater, let that dry, 45 minutes, an hour. Then take the film, put it on my exposure unit, like vacuum table. It's big glass. Lift that up. There's halogen light, flares for like 10 seconds. It's really bright. So like the shorter you expose the film on the screen, the more detail you're going to have. So if you can have a really bright light, really short, you don't have a lot of photons bouncing around. It's going to be like super tight. And so I use those films because they're accurate. They're accurate, you know, perfectly. They haven't distorted. People get film output by like Epson printers, the big laser printers. And for some reason, the mechanism is plastic, or the film is like
It doesn't have
not
quite the
very
resolution,
stable.
right?
You will actually, like, if you want a square, sometimes you're making something like this that's off like 1/8 of an inch on this side. And if the next one is off 1/8 of an inch on this side, then when I try to line stuff up, it's like a mess, you know?
Have you ever done off-register stuff? I mean, you mentioned Gary
Sure,
Panner earlier
sure.
and stuff like that. There's a whole like kind of great look you get when even Mad Magazine used to screw with that and stuff.
Yeah. In fact, you know, not to harp on situationism, but I did a cover for Grail Marcus's
Lipstick Traces? Oh, no kidding. That's,
yeah, I did
that's
the 20th
a great book to read.
20th anniversary edition of that. Did a cover.
Wow.
And the back cover was a Mutants poster that I did, and it was all completely out. It had a situationist cartoon.
Was that like a Mutants reunion or something?
It was Mutants, Social Unrest, and Avengers.
Oh
So
my
it was
God,
just
with
like
Penelope and everything.
oh
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, dude. And that was like in 1995 or
You know,
6 or 7.
We got Sally Webster living in New York from the Mutants. This is a
Awesome.
great band.
Yeah.
I would tell you a story, but this is being taped.
Hot, Mike.
Catch me afterwards.
But it was called Paris because I did everything off register and put Paris Hilton over everything. So there was like the riot scene where the overturned cars, but then Paris Hilton, and
that's pure
Yeah.
situationist.
Yeah.
Situationist work. I love it.
But that was the back cover of the book.
Right.
And they actually, I said, "Are you going to have any trouble?" This is Harvard University Press, and I'm like, "Are you going to have any trouble with like Paris Hilton?" It was so subtly done. It's like a kind of a white glaze that if you put 3D glasses on, everything goes burp and she just pops out, but you can't see it otherwise.
Wow, it's sort of like the Shrouded Turin kind of like.
You know, so that I'm like, I did the Warfield Regency series from like 2008 until about 2017, and I was producing posters that were for the club, so I did every act that came through the door. And it was so many posters, so fast, that I realized that if I didn't get a website and start to like sell mine, I was gonna just be out of business in about like 4 months. Because I was like we were making so many posters. Plus it was like an embarrassment of riches. I started to bring all my friends on board. Like any artist that knew how to make a poster was getting a job from me. And then we were producing those in the studio. And so I worked with Zoltron and David Hunter and Ron Donovan.
Yeah,
and
of course. You got a lot of people work there.
Yeah. It was actually to the point where people were like going, you guys are a collective, right? You know, because, the other guys were claiming, oh yeah, that's my shop, There
you go.
And I'm like, you don't discourage that.
It's your shop,
'cause
but I'm paying the rent.
Yeah.
So one thing, because I don't want to throw any other artists under the bus here, but one of the things you always kept as a part of your integrity is that your shows are real. They're all connected to real shows, and
Yes.
maybe they're not being wheat pasted on the streets because it's too valuable an item to do that, but they're all connected in that way and related in with merchandise like the way T-shirts or
Right.
albums would be. But there's a lot of, right now there's or I don't know if it's still going on, a fair amount of fiction of these things where it's just like, let's just take a cool venue, make up a date and put a band there and like make a cool image and people buy it as the artifact, and it's not.
You brought up two issues, and one is so I can kind of loop in politics a little
Please.
bit. Okay, so the posters are rarefied because of the price and stuff like that. I try to keep it mellow, but I know the second that they get out in the world, they start to like
Flip on eBay also.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. But I also always try to keep connected to like mass editions and posters that can stay at like even a $30 or $40 range. So whenever I do political posters, even if I do a version that's a screen print, like the ERA poster I did recently, we're going to be producing like $30 offset prints, and it's going to be open edition, and we'll probably distribute like 5,000 or 6,000 over the summer, because they're just going to go on a...
Is this like in tribute to the old Equal Rights Amendment, ERA?
No, they're really trying to get it ratified.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
I gave up on that in around 78.
No, they're actually... The woman who started
Bless these progressives. They never quit.
I know. We're hard-headed. Katie Hornig started vote equality in Virginia and got it ratified in Virginia, thus getting it over the 38-state threshold, except for a couple had dropped out, but their vote, when they ratified it, counts. It would have counted if it was like a smoky old backroom boys club kind of amendment, but it isn't, and it's a different one. It's an amendment that really disturbs the natural order of society as it's being seen. And so this low bar is not good enough. So they're making a higher bar. So they're on the road. Vote equality does two things. It's like to make sure that like voting is open to all people.
Just trying to fight the suppressions going on.
Yep, voter suppression. But they're also trying to pass the ERA. And so I'm skinning like 4 or 5 vans, buses, and box trucks. And they're going to be distributing posters, going to rallies, doing voter drives all over the South. Because, I'm big with...
George has been like the, ground zero for that.
Yeah. And I did the same thing with the
Stacey
3
Abrams.
Women's March posters I did. I did I think on 1 or 2 of them I did a screen print version or a wood panel version and made art prints out of it. But there's like this mass edition that you can buy on the Outrage for $29, and people are putting them up in their school classrooms if they're teachers or like HR departments or whatever, just
Not in
to sort
Florida.
of send a message.
In Florida, they'll lose their job.
Yeah, true. But okay, so wait, let me remember the other part.
Let's open it up to some people.
Yeah,
Because
but
we could go on for hours, and it's just like, and then we'll start gossiping, and we'll get really nasty. So let's. People have some questions.
Why Fort Wayne and not Ohio? Because I'm from Ohio. As far as I'm concerned, it's close enough. But it's it'd be really cool. I think every artist would have a museum show if it were up to the artist to choose the institution that wants to accept them. And I'll take the opportunity to thank the Fort Wayne Museum of Art for inviting me, for Josef curating, and Charles Shepard, the director, president, letting all this happen. Because this is a little unusual for a museum to be so accessible to everyone and to allow me to sell prints, to do what we do as our scene, and it's, I think it's maybe the strength of the show, that we can do something like so open air. So I would love to be at the Dayton Art Institute. It would be really
That's
cool.
his hometown, to be clear.
That's my hometown. I grew up in Dayton. I even took classes at the Dayton Art Institute, so they'd be welcoming me home. She asked if there was any particular poster or 2 or 3 that were like uniquely challenging. For me, the challenge isn't as much in the registration. I'll work that out. I mean, there will be like head-scratching moments where I go, God, it doesn't look like it's lining up. But in the end, I've been really careful, and I can get the black to trap everything so that it doesn't look like a mess, right? or if I'm doing something really free form, it's not so free form you can't understand what I'm trying to get across. It's when a poster goes into overtime. And me and Ron Donovan, when I was doing Firehouse Custom Rock Art Company, we had a series of posters we were making for Eric Clapton. And Ron kept like wanting to push some technical, boundaries on stuff. So we did the first one. He hand sanded something like 700 sheets of paper with sandpaper, and then used non-archival shoe polish varnish or something like wood varnish to give it a wood texture. And I mean, first of all, the paper was going to just completely eat itself after about 40 years, but it was also, there was all this paper dust in the air. And I was like, Ron, on the next poster, can we come up with a concept that's like a little more manageable, that isn't like destroying the shop or, it was about a 10-day process of sanding paper just before we got started. So messy. And then
which were the artists that have been most difficult to work with? We can cut this out. Maybe this is just something for the room, but like...
So okay, but I'm getting to the really hard one. We got asked to do 10,000 posters for an Australian tour. And I'm like, 10,000 posters? I'm going to take control of this. We're not sanding paper. We're not doing anything like that. And so I devised a 4-color poster, and we did it 2 up, so we only had to do 5,000, which filled our racks like 17 or 18 times, and it was like half a color a day. Like, I would leave all the equipment in the press and just wash the screen, and then I'd have to like run a bunch of make-ready sheets just to get the ink out of the press in the morning and finish the color the next day. And if it's a slow, laborious process, when it takes 2 days per color, it's, so we were complete. I was like, I don't want to make 10,000 posters ever again. So, I'm being asked by Robert if there's any band that I either would, that I haven't worked with, that I'd like to work with, or one that I haven't worked with for whatever reason. I think the obvious, it's like the elephant in the room. Why haven't I done a Fish poster? And it's because they haven't asked me. I was working over the last couple of years with a guy that does the Trey Anastasio posters, and he was contacting me, and I think he contacted me for a show that Trey was doing last month, but I was working on this, so I couldn't take that one. But I started working for Trey, but apparently doing a Trey poster is not good enough. So, if Fish ever gets a hold of this video, I would say yes. So, okay. Have I ever considered NFTs? I've considered it. If I'm going to get into NFTs, I want to get in, like, on the top notch, because I think it's really about socializing in the NFT community. I think you want to make it, like, have a rationale for it so that it makes sense, because it's really very free-form at the moment. You can kind of create what you want to create. So if I'm going to do it, I'm going to have a strategy, but I haven't developed a strategy on NFTs yet. I actually kind of sat back and said, no, I'm not interested, because it hasn't really percolated down into what it's going to be. But then on the other side, I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that I really prefer the actual analog object. And I'm not denigrating NFTs or your world at all. It's just that I'm a hands-on printer guy. Like, I don't just do the art digitally or whatever and hand it to the printer. I'm the guy that likes to get his hands dirty, and I like to deal with real paper. And I know that you can devise NFT strategies where the blockchain is part of the real object. So if I ever approach NFTs, it's probably going to be in the spirit of a actual, analog, real-world object. So that's my answer there.
All right.
Awesome. So it's not a no.
And then you, my friend.
So Chuck specifically.
Okay. So he's asking me. He's a fan of the wood panels that I make, and he's asking me about like the different substrates that I use, like different woods. I've used different wood types and different paper types, and how I feel about that stuff. My favorite substrate is mulberry paper. It's like Japanese. It's ridiculous, though. Yeah, they have a long tradition of like beautiful paper making, and the stuff, though like as thin as a Kleenex tissue, it just doesn't change shape when you print on it. It's crazy. It's counterintuitive, but it's this beautiful thin paper. It's got a great surface. It does great things with the ink. It's very archival. And I had, and I still have, like a kind of a direct connection with a supplier that's getting it straight from Japan, and I love that paper. I moved to wood because I wanted to do bigger things, and paper is really unwieldy at like large sizes. It becomes a hassle for you. It becomes a hassle for me. It crimps and it gets damaged really easily, and they have to frame it, and so the wood panel like actually just holds up really big, and so that was kind of a practical consideration. And I started printing on birch. The birch kind of is low grade. It's really not the printing surface is great, but the value of birch as a wood is just sometimes its quality varies a lot because it's basically plywood, But so I wanted to up my wood game, and I started using white oak because white oak actually, I saw a comment online from a woodworker that said, "Man, white oak is like so uneven. It's got all those textures and all the
grain.
The grain, thank you. And but that's what I like about it. It's so different. It gives you a dimension, and I kind of like the symbology of oak. Oak is about truth, and the naiads are oak spirits, and so I work with oak. I've printed on just about everything, steel and other substrates, but I just prefer wood panels. Yeah.
I love them too. Thank you.
Right on.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Right on, dude.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.